I cannot tell you enough how excited I am by this program, for all of you for showing up for this conversation. My name is Dr. Elaine Arnott, and I'm the president and CEO here at the National Liberty Museum. And I want to welcome you to the NLM and to our inaugural Flame Forum. We created the Flame Forum because liberty is not an abstract idea. It is a living practice. It requires us to test our convictions, sharpen our disagreements, and still find a way to remain connected as citizens. The Flame Forum is designed to model that practice. It brings together people and organizations that often disagree, even profoundly, so that we can show what it looks like to debate without destruction, to listen across divides, and to engage without silencing. This event is also the capstone of our year of free speech. Over the past year, we posted artists, students, scholars, teachers, and community members from across the spectrum. We've seen firsthand that free speech is not only about the right to speak, it's about the responsibility to listen, to respond, and to remain in relationships even when we deeply disagree. Tonight continues that work. And we're going to have a little honest moment too, because I run a Liberty Museum and that's what I can do. So convening this conversation wasn't easy. We had some organizations that were invited and declined to participate. And in the days leading up to tonight, I received emails questioning why the stage looks the way it does. Yes, 3 white men. And one message in particular ended with the words, "Shame on you." Yes. That's an excellent question. Amen. Amen. All right. The conversation's already started. That critique reflects something bigger happening in our culture. We've become quick to shame and slow to show up. We measure a conversation's worth by the optics of who is in the room, rather by the content and whether the conversation is happening at all. So let me be clear, representation matters deeply, but the color of your skin and your gender does not dictate your perspective on liberty. Ideas do not break neatly into demographic lines. And here at the National Liberty Museum, we refuse to reduce people to what they look like by embracing a diversity of perspective and thought. And for the record, if you didn't notice, our moderator happens to be a woman of color. Am I close time to be called a white man? She also curated this fantastic panel. But that shouldn't matter. But it does show how easily true diversity gets overlooked when we focus only on optics. So what matters most is this. Our panelists have the courage to bring their convictions into the public view, to risk disagreement, and to model what debate can look like when we choose persuasion over punishment and listening over labeling. Debbie will go more into the speakers themselves, but we're bringing together leaders from PEN America, FIRE, and Alliance Defending Freedom, organizations that rarely share the stage. They, of course, agree, which is also very key, on many things, but they can disagree fiercely, and that's exactly why they're here. Because liberty expands when we all dare to argue across differences. So my invitation tonight is very simple. Lean in. Don't just listen for what you already believe. Listen for what challenges you, what stretches you, and maybe even what frustrates you. That's the work of liberty. So I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. Thank you for engaging with us in this year of free speech. Thank you for helping us keep the flame of liberty burning. So with that, I am honored to introduce our lovely moderator. She is not a white man, I promise. She's also a National Liberty Museum board member and a very dear friend. This is Debbie Gate. Debbie believes deeply in protecting individual rights and in the strength of community. With a background in law, nonprofit leadership, and foundation management, she has dedicated her career to helping mission-driven leaders achieve their most urgent priorities. She now serves as president of Steadfast, where she continues that work every day. Please help me in joining Debbie.
All right, I'm going to grab this and sit down. That's okay. I'm on a leash. That's all right. Okay. Thank you, Elaine, for that introduction and for setting the context for why we are very excited to have this conversation with all of you. Elaine is right. This was not an easy panel to pull together, but I'm really, truly delighted that in the end we have three wonderful yes men who are here. And I think we're going to get into a conversation that will bring out some of the things that we share and some of the things that we have some differences around. And that's our goal, is to have that conversation and share it with you and then bring you in. There will be time for questions. So I encourage you to think of what, what's on your mind as you listen to this. So our topic, free speech, has not been in the news at all lately. It happens to be, as Jonathan will probably mention, it's Banned Books Week. That's very current. You have a case that was in the Supreme Court 2 days ago, Giles versus Salazar, that Jim was in the Supreme Court arguing 2 days ago, and that is also a free speech case. You have Jimmy Kimmel and everything that surrounded his being pulled off the air and then coming back on the air and everybody weighing in on it. And then, of course, we had the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And that happened very recently, and that thrust, free speech issues, political violence. Can we use our words instead of more aggressive means to actually discuss our differences? So part of the reason this panel means so much to Elaine, to me, to the museum, is because at moments like this, it's a reminder to all of us that even if we disagree, we can use our words to explore that disagreement, and then we don't have to resort to violence or other things, right? So that's why this feels very important and special. So why these three? I'm going to introduce them so you have their formal titles, because that's really important. They are important people in what they do. But I also want to give you a sense of what each of their organization's mission is, because I think that'll help you get a sense of the breadth that we have here. And then we'll start talking. Okay. So Jim Campbell is Chief Legal Counsel at Alliance Defending Freedom, and he leads U.S. litigation and appellate strategy. He served as the Nebraska Solicitor General and has argued cases before the Supreme Court, including Tuesday. Alliance Defending Freedom's mission is to protect the right of people to freely live out their faith, and litigates for religious freedom, free speech, parental rights, and related constitutional liberties. So this is Jim, and that's his organization. Next to Jim is Bob Kornrevier, and Bob is Chief Counsel at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, and he is truly a veteran First Amendment litigator. He has 4 decades of experience in media and free expression law. Now, Bob works at FIRE. FIRE's mission is to defend and sustain the individual rights of all Americans to free speech and free thought, focusing on higher education and public institutions where expression rights are contested. Okay. And then finally, Jonathan Friedman. Jonathan is the Cy Symes Managing Director of U.S. Free Expression Programs at PEN America. So he leads research, advocacy, and education on book bans, campus speech, and educational gag orders. What is the mission at PEN America? PEN America's mission is to defend and celebrate free expression in the United States and worldwide, opposing censorship and supporting writers and educators. So as you hear the missions of these 3 organizations, I hope it jumped out at you, because it did to me, that free speech is something that is in common in all three missions. Okay. So sometimes these organizations end up on the same side of something. Sometimes these organizations end up on the opposite side of things. And when they're on the same side, they work together. And when they're on the opposite side, they will fight, not with their fists, with their words, with their ideas, to help get to better answers and to truth. So today, I hope we're going to discover what it is that we have in common, where we differ, and how free speech is something that can actually be an underlying value that can surpass all of this difference. All right. So we're going to start by getting to know them a little bit better, because I've just done a lot of talking about them, but now we want to hear, like, who are these people? And my first question, you're each going to answer the same question, but we want to know what makes each of you so passionate about free speech that you decided to make a career fighting for it. All right, and Jim, I'm going to start with you.
So, that was almost a disaster. So, disaster averted. Early on in my life, I saw that as I heard more perspectives and as I learned more and as I saw more, I understood better. And so I became really enamored with the idea of ensuring that we were able to fully dialogue on issues. And for me in particular, and one of the things that you noted about the organization I work for is that we focus in particular on religious liberty in addition to religious freedom. And so one aspect of that continual striving for more information, more learning, more development is particularly in the search for truth. That's something that has captivated me as a young person. And I think it's so vital that we all have the ability to search for that truth and to have open dialogue with each other, to push and challenge. And that, for me, is the way that I refine my thinking, and that's how I best search for truth, is when I talk to others and get their perspective. So all that to say, that's really where my passion comes from.
Great, thank you. Jonathan, what about you?
Well, I would say for me, first and foremost, I'm really an educator. I have a background in the arts, and I have a PhD where I was trained to be a historian and a sociologist with a focus on sort of global exchange and international cultural understanding. I think that sort of unique mix really attracted me to free speech from a pretty young age, just in terms of being somebody who really, doesn't like being told what to think and what to say and what to do and not do. And I think that, that you'll find that thread actually among a lot of people who work in free speech, which is a kind of, James Dean rebel idea. But I mean, that is fundamental to the traditions of free speech in the United States that I think really provide unique answers to the fundamental challenge of how we all get along. It's interesting to think about this as a conversation about free speech when I am certain we would all define what we mean by that or how we evaluate that differently. In some ways, the conversation about free speech is actually always a conversation about, well, where do you draw the lines around free speech? It's not so much about speech, it's more about regulation of speech. And that's where I think we probably may differ more than we agree. I don't know. But for me, that is a really fascinating question that we all kind of have to deal with. So, you can try and say you don't think about free speech, you don't know it, it's not in your life, but it's actually fundamental to how, all of us wake up every day, talk to our kids, talk to our parents, understand that as we move through different settings, from a subway to a home to a dinner table, etc., we're, in these spaces where rules about speech are actually fundamentally going on in our minds all the time. Even now, I'm speaking, but people are okay with that, So, anyways,
the night is young.
Yeah, for now, anyways. So
Just
for me,
wait.
for me, that's always been, just what brought me to this, and just sort of that power of, persuasion of the arts, of that sort of freedom to humanistically move other people. I think that that's what we do with speech, and that's what humans, all of us, love about it, and that's why I think it's just so central to our humanity.
Jonathan James Dean Friedman. All right. So, Bob, what about you?
I'm one of those weird people that knew when I started law school that I just wanted to do First Amendment law, which is kind of good that it worked out because I didn't have a plan B. And I attribute knowing that when I got to law school to three different things. One is I was a high school debater, and actually high school, and then went to college on a debate scholarship. And so the whole concept of debate and civil exchange of ideas was sort of ingrained in me from all of that experience. The second thing is I was a reporter when I was in college. Actually, from 15 on, I was working for my community newspaper, and then did that as a part-time job while I was in college. And to top it off, that was during the Watergate era, when everyone wanted to be Woodward and Bernstein. So it was a very formative time, and I knew I wanted to pursue that. And I had a coworker at my paper that said, there's such a thing as media law. You might want to look into it when you get to law school. And then the third thing that sort of iced it was that James Dean spirit that you mentioned, and that is, I hate bullies. And there's no bigger bully than having someone in government telling you what you can say, or what you can think, or what you can feel. And so by the time I got to law school, I was totally lost to all of that.
Amazing. So you've all highlighted something that I think is important. It sometimes we think free speech is something that's easily defined. There are words on a paper, we read the First Amendment out loud, and there it is, the right to free speech. Putting it into practice and actually figuring out how it applies in different situations is not so obvious, and is actually very difficult, and does take brains like this to be working on it, and the Supreme Court to be considering it. And so we have this developing body of law that's continuously developing as we confront new questions and new applications for the principle of free speech. So what we're going to do for a few minutes is talk about one case in particular and bring out some of the issues around free speech so that we get some grounding around the principle, what's involved, and what the legal side of it includes and doesn't include. And then we're going to go to more of lightning round discussion around some of the things I mentioned at the start that are in the news. So time for the educational component, and we are going to hear from all three of our panelists their thoughts on a particular case, and then get ready to start thinking about how all of that applies to what you're reading in the news. So how many people remember there was a case involving Masterpiece Cake Shop? It was a baker and a same-sex couple, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Do people remember this case? All right. Well, Jim's organization argued the case on behalf of the baker. So just to quickly summarize, this was a case where a baker was asked to make a cake for a same-sex couple that was getting married, and the baker declined. And under Colorado, there is something called a public accommodation law, where businesses cannot discriminate on the basis of certain things. And so this actually became a lawsuit. Baker didn't want to bake a cake. Couple wanted the cake. Colorado law says, public accommodation law makes it sound as though they should be able to get a cake. And then we have the right to free speech of the baker, whether or not the baker has to make this cake, whether the baker's compelled to make this cake. So, Jim, this case, could you tell us a little bit about what the key free speech issues were, what the main arguments were, and what the court decided?
Yeah. So the case involved two claims. There was a free speech claim, and there was also a religious exercise, a free exercise claim. So the free speech claim is essentially that a custom-made cake to celebrate an event like a wedding is an iconic symbol, and it is something that is expressive, it is artistic, and you can't force someone to do it when they're being asked to celebrate a message or express a message that they disagree with. That was essentially that argument in a nutshell. The religious exercise argument, I'll touch on that later because that's actually the basis upon which the case was decided. So that was the argument we were making. And one of the points that we constantly emphasized when litigating that case was how you might be someone that very much disagrees with Jack Phillips, the cake artist in that case. But the principles cut both ways. So whether you're someone like Jack Phillips that doesn't want to create a custom cake celebrating a view of marriage that you disagree with, that same principle would apply to a lesbian graphic designer who is asked to make a website or a flyer or some other kind of expressive item to celebrate some religious event that took a different view on marriage. So this is a principle of free speech that if it's done right, it usually cuts across ideological divides and protects people no matter what their views are. So that was the argument we made to the court. The court didn't decide it on those grounds. One other point that I think is really important to emphasize is we repeatedly stress that our free speech argument in the public accommodation context is quite narrow. Usually when you go into a business and you purchase something, you're not purchasing a custom-made piece of speech. So the vast majority of commercial transactions would not implicate the arguments we were making. And then beyond that, so it has to be custom created, it has to be an item that's made that expresses a message, and the owner has to object to the message that item would express, not to just serving the person because of who that person is. It's the distinction between speech and status, or message and status. You can object to a message that you're being asked to communicate, but you can't just object to working with someone because of who they are. So those were the arguments. The Supreme Court did not decide the case on free speech grounds. It decided it on a pretty narrow religious freedom ground, and the court said that there were two factors that stood out to it. One, there were hostile comments made by the government officials who decided the case against Jack Phillips, and they said that revealed their animosity towards his faith. And so that was one problem the court identified. And then the second problem the court identified is that there was another gentleman in the state of Colorado who went to 3 other cake shops and asked for custom items that had messages disparaging same-sex marriage. So they were quite interesting cake requests, but the messages on all the requests were messages that were against same-sex marriage. And all 3 of those cake shops declined, and this gentleman filed complaints against all 3 of them, and the state of Colorado said, that all of those were fine. And so the Supreme Court was bothered by the fact that the state of Colorado was treating these sets of requests differently. And then ultimately, as I said, the Supreme Court did not decide those free speech questions in that case, but if you fast forward 5 years later, I believe Masterpiece was in 2018, and then in 2023 was a case called 303 Creative, which involved a graphic designer, and the court there did address the free speech issue and did rule in favor of that creative professional on the grounds that we had argued for in Masterpiece Cake Shop.
So Jim, what kind of opposition did Jack Phillips face?
A significant amount. A lot of people, I always draw a difference between or distinction in my mind between the culture of free speech and then the technicalities of free speech from the government. The culture of free speech was not very kind to Mr. Phillips. He had death threats. We had to set up security, extra security at his shop. There were people that very much disagreed with his perspective and his desire to live consistent with his perspective and to make his custom cakes consistent with his perspective. So that was an unfortunate part of the case, but now he's through that and moved beyond it, but that is something that he endured.
It's not always easy to stand up in a legal case. So we sometimes forget there are real people on both sides of those cases. Jonathan, so PEN America and ADF are sometimes on the opposite side of cases. Was the Masterpiece
/303 creative, if you want to address that. Was that one of them? And did the court get it right?
Yeah, I would say I think we're almost always on the opposite side of these
Fair.
cases. I struggle to find it. I'm not sure. I think there are elements that we aren't on the opposite side of. So, the idea of these rules and how we enforce them cutting both ways, or I would say probably cutting in more ways, because it's almost always more than two, But, I do think that's really critical to think about here. The challenge, in these cases and so many others is, we're not just judging free speech in the abstract on its own, right? We're judging free speech alongside other social considerations, human dignity, equality, a pluralistic society. And I think this is where, the public and public accommodation becomes very challenging to sort of sit alongside the free speech arguments, because certainly when we think about freelance artists who are doing custom-made projects, communicating a message, as Jim said, we think about that as a form of expression, a form of speech. I think the complication easily becomes, though, that we can start to see many kinds of expression, many kinds of products that people might custom make as forms of speech, and then if we are allowing people to say, I'm going to serve some people who come in the door if their messages are ones I agree with, and then not others, well, it does start to sort of open up, challenges that the United States has had for a long time with discrimination in public services, in public businesses, et cetera. And I do think, the animosity towards Jack Phillips in this, it's awful, and the animosity is terrible. The political climate, the cultural climate around how we disagree and how we live together is at probably an all-time low. And I think almost all of us in any political position, no matter what our views are experiencing that, are probably upset by it. I think that it's not getting better. But at the same time, I think this case really does raise a lot of, complicated free speech questions. Should we, allow that this is a kind of expression, and then the government can force, let's say, compel the baker to make it? Well, how far can that go from there? Can you sort of tell someone that they have to do something if it is deeply against their personally held conscience? There are risks to that. There are complexities in that. Can you tell someone that they, must make a song that they, personally disagree with if they sell songs? I think ultimately, the concern that I have is about how these cases open up to more discrimination, in both directions. I think but again, it cuts both ways. So, let's take the three bakeries that also refused the cakes. My view would probably be that that all of it is problematic, that all of those refusals, if we're going to say that the public accommodations law means, if we're going to say that in this diverse society where we're going to disagree with each other a lot, that the baseline is going to be that you can pick and choose who you want to serve based on how people walk in. If you're going to, to me, it's sort of like to your point earlier, should I go to this panel tonight with people who probably vehemently disagree, but if I take one look at them, I might, think that they're all going to say the same thing. In other words, even this panel is a situation in which one could say, I'm going to make a passive judgment quickly and not really pay attention to the message, or say I disagree with the message of that, even and without listening to it whatsoever. So I just worry about the can of worms that the case and the logical conclusions of what we're talking about go to.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. So before I go to Bob, Jim, do you want to respond to anything that Jonathan just raised about the case and about the tension between discrimination and free speech?
I think I addressed some of that with the point I made about how narrow the argument is. And one of the things that I find interesting is that for years we were on the opposite side of that case against the ACLU. And then the ACLU for years kept telling us, no, your argument is going too far. It's going to open up Pandora's box, and we don't know what's going to happen. And then as soon as we won the case, and as soon as the Supreme Court announced the rule that we had been asking for, and we kept telling the Supreme Court, emphasize that this only applies when it's making a custom item, and when that item expresses something, and when the person who's asked to make it objects to the message of that item and not just to the status of the person. And the ACLU came out with an article soon after that said, no, this decision's really narrow. It's limited to when it's a custom-made item, when it's has a message in it, and when the person's objecting to the message. And we thought, that's what we've been saying all along. So I take the point, and it's a fair point, and it's a fair argument. I think the court did a good job of limiting the theory so that it's not unwieldy. But this is part of the debate that we've had for many years. It's a great discussion, and I think the court decided it in a way that it is narrow.
Well, that's part of what I'm going to ask Bob. So it was not a unanimous court decision. It was 7-2.
That one, that one was 7-2, and I guess I should be clearer. When I said when the Supreme Court decided it, I was really referring to the 303 Creative case when it finally got to the speech question, not to the Masterpiece Cake Shop decision. But the Masterpiece Cake Shop was, again, on religious freedom grounds and a 7-2 decision, and then the 303 Creative that eventually resolved those free speech issues was a 6-3 decision.
Okay, so not even the Supreme Court agrees on this. So, Bob, again, many times people, when they first hear the case, they very quickly think, well, this is straightforward. It's obvious, and they jump for one side or the other because that lines up with their conception of the world, right? Supreme Court's not unanimous in making these decisions. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth us thinking about what's the most convincing argument on the other side of these cases that those of us who care about free speech should make a point of understanding. Could you help us with all of this?
Well, I can try. First of all, I want to just say that I appreciate the fact that both Jim and Jonathan talked about the culture of free speech, because it's really an important aspect of this case, and it's something that is very much a part of FIRE's mission, that we care not just about the law of free speech, that's the minimum floor that in a free society we should uphold, but also a broader concept of a culture of free speech where people seek out ideas and viewpoints that they disagree with and tolerate the fact that those ideas can be expressed. That's all, I think those two concepts work together to create a free society. In terms of how this works, first I should say, FIRE at the time of the Masterpiece Cake Shop case didn't file a brief in the case because at the time FIRE was known as the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education and focused exclusively on free speech issues involving higher education. 3 years ago, FIRE expanded its mission to cover free speech in general. So I can't speak to a FIRE institutional position on the case, but I can talk about an amicus brief that may get to the question that you asked, that I filed on behalf of the First Amendment Lawyers Association in the case. And in that brief, we advocated on behalf of the baker because of, I think, what gets to the more fundamental and deeper First Amendment questions. And you say that when first presented with this case, many people will think it's very straightforward. And the first thing that people will say is, it's cake. What do you mean speech? We're talking about a baker here. And that first threshold question had to be addressed by asking whether or not we're talking about art. And that's why when Jim mentioned that it is a custom-baked item to celebrate a specific thing, that was a really key fact in this case, that we are talking about an artistic creation. There were some really wonderful briefs filed showing the very different kinds of artistic designs that are possible, not just for wedding cakes, but all kinds of cakes that were very expressive, very artistic, and really made the point that we are talking about an act of creation. We're talking about expression in a sense the First Amendment does reach. And then you have to ask the question, then what is the state's authority to compel someone to create a work of art. And when you view it as purely a First Amendment question like that, the answer should be really simple. I can't think of a case, I've been doing this for a long time, I can't think of a case where the court has required someone not just to speak words that the state wants, but to create an expressive piece of art. And so, from my perspective, the answer was very straightforward from a First Amendment perspective. Now, as Jim mentioned, the court didn't reach the First Amendment question and wouldn't until several years later with the 303 Creative case. I thought that was a dodge. I had really hoped that the court would address the First Amendment question, the free speech question, in Masterpiece Cake Shop. And I filed a brief on behalf of the First Amendment Lawyers Association, which was an organization historically of porn lawyers. So it's an indication.
I didn't know that fact at the time. That's an interesting wrinkle I didn't realize.
Welcome to the party. But to me, it's an illustration of the way in which First Amendment concepts are indivisible. That the First Amendment, if it's going to work for anyone, has to work for everyone. There was quite a bit of debate within the First Amendment Lawyers Association whether or not to take that position, and whether or not we should file. And ultimately, after an extended debate inside the organization, the decision was made to go forward, and so we filed that brief. And ultimately, those free speech arguments were addressed in 303 Creative. Now, on Jonathan's part, I would agree that in terms of having a cohesive society, certain things like public accommodation laws have been very important, and particularly established in the 1960s during the Civil Rights era. And that's where the narrowness of this case and the decision in it is so critical. And it's because it was based purely on the compelled message and not on the status of people. And particularly in the facts of the case, the baker basically said to the couple that he refused to bake a cake for, you can buy anything in the store. It is open to you. We will do business with you anytime. But because of my Christian beliefs, I just can't make a cake and a specific creation for that purpose. And so that was the narrow principle involved, and not whether or not you could have a denial of service simply because he didn't like the sexual orientation of the customers.
But I mean, where can it go from there? I mean, let's say that in my faith, I don't believe that black people should marry white people, so I won't make you a cake.
Well,
is that discrimination?
The idea is that
it's a custom-made thing.
You can't be compelled to deliver that message, the state-approved message.
So is that discrimination?
No, it's a failure of the government to have the ability to compel speech.
You see why this is not straightforward.
And
Jim, go ahead, Jim.
Well, I was just going to say on that issue, I could see court going two different ways. So Bob suggests that maybe the government wouldn't be able to get involved in your hypothetical, the case that you've suggested might arise. I could see the court has said that race discrimination is sui generis in our society, so I could see maybe a court coming out and saying, so that's one thing for everyone to keep in mind is the First Amendment isn't absolute. The First Amendment usually is subjected to what they call strict scrutiny under the law, right? And so if you show that what you're trying to do is either engage in speech and the government's stopping you, or the government's forcing you to speak and you don't want to, strict scrutiny applies, and that requires the government to prove that it has a compelling interest, and this is the narrowest way of doing it is like the technical terminology, which basically means they got to have a really, really good reason for doing it. And so if it could satisfy strict scrutiny in certain circumstances, perhaps
I'm not sure strict scrutiny would help you in this situation. Right. The First Amendment isn't an absolute, but there are certain principles in First Amendment law that come close to that line, and compelled speech is one of them. That was established in the 1940s in a case called Barnett versus West Virginia Board of Education, which said that the state couldn't compel Jehovah's Witnesses students to recite the Pledge of Allegiance and salute the flag. And that compelled speech doctrine is something that applies pretty much across the board. I don't think you could say that if you could show that the state's interest was compelling And this is the least restrictive way we can think of doing it, that you would satisfy strict scrutiny if you're compelling people to give speech. And to pick up your example, once you narrow it to the compelled speech issue, you can say that one of the terrible problems plaguing our society is racism. No question about that. But I don't think the state could require school children to stand up every morning and give a non-racist pledge. Compelling people to confess by word or deed things that are not in their own conscience is something that the First Amendment does not permit.
All right, so I'm gonna bring the cake discussion to an end because, I mean, it started with
I must say one thing.
You must, okay.
I must say
You must.
One thing. I
Please
believe
do.
there is a great doctrinal conversation here about free speech, but I want, let's be honest culturally about that case and the series of cases which are before the Supreme Court. You take the identical facts, you take the identical judges, you take all the identical things, and you make it a cake about a Jewish bar mitzvah, and the person doesn't want to make the cake. You make it about intermarriage. You make it about a whole host of things, and I don't think those judges make that same decision. And I think there is a failure, which we can speak a little bit honestly about here on this stage, to be consistent when we think about free speech, because that case involves same-sex marriage and the particular histories of religion in this country, and the association of Christianity, which is still very much part of American heritage in a society that's struggling with pluralism. And I think if you change some of those variables, I just don't see this sort of I don't see the narrowness of it being something that would be seen as so acceptable.
So let's move on, because I think I actually think what the conversation that's starting here is going to repeat itself when we start talking about some of the current controversies that we're reading about in the news. And I really want to turn us there, because this is like about a cake that was made years ago. It didn't get made years ago. And I was looking up how many people and organizations filed briefs on this case. And it was wild. I mean, you
100.
had celebrity chefs filing, amicus briefs on this case. I mean, there was a lot at stake over this cake. So we're going to move on from
I
the
will just
cake.
say, for the argument that morning,
Yeah.
the Supreme Court bar line extended outside the building and around the corner. I have never seen that before.
So there's a reason for it, and you got a sense of why people wanted to really engage on the issues that were in this case. So are we ready to talk about some of the things that are in the news today? Yes. Okay. All right. So let's start with probably the most violent of the situations that I mentioned earlier. Let's start with the Charlie Kirk assassination. I think everybody was shocked when that news, no matter what, where you stand on Turning Point USA or on Charlie Kirk, I think there was a sense of shock when that happened. And the discussion has been around how one of the things that Charlie Kirk did was engage. He was on a stage on a college campus engaging with an audience, which is a form of, obviously, speech. And so here we're going to just go around the horn here and hear from our panelists what they think about the free speech component of this violent act and what reflections you've had as you think about the value of free speech and what happened to Charlie. And Jim, I'll start with you.
A couple thoughts. One is this one hit home for me in a way that a lot of things don't. I didn't actually know Charlie, but I know a lot of people who do. And so for that reason, it definitely hit home for me. And I'm someone who, like my friends up here on the panel, get up in front of people and speak about free speech a lot. And so whether I speak from a perspective that tends to fall politically maybe closer to Charlie's, or even if I were on the opposite side, this is something that I do a lot. And so it really did leave me a little shaken for a couple days. Although it also reconfirmed my commitment to the importance of free speech and to continue to have these dialogues. And because we can't move past things like this unless we commit to continuing to have the discussions and to continue to be open to seeing other people's perspectives, even if we disagree with them. And I guess the last point I would make is just, what can we do as individuals to separate the views from the people? Because when we start to conflate the two, that's when free speech starts falling apart. And when we can respect and cherish and appreciate people, even if we disagree with them, but still disagree with their ideas and just cherish them and the dignity that's in them, that to me is what we need to keep working on.
All right. Thank you, Jim. Bob?
This assassination was a graphic illustration of the critical importance of free speech as an antidote to violence. It is the alternative to resolving things in violent ways, and it is really the only alternative to resolving things without resorting to violence. One of the arguments that we've had to confront over in recent years is an argument made by people who equate violent words, or they basically say that words are violence, and for that reason we should be able to suppress certain words, whether it's hate speech or whatever else. Well, this is a graphic illustration that violence is violence, and this kind of violence is not speech. And so we need to find ways to recommit to civil dialogue. One of the findings from FIRE's recently released college survey, unfortunately, is that we've seen a rise over the past few years of the number of college students who think that it is acceptable to respond to speech they disagree with some act of violence. And we ask that question on various dimensions. And just in the past 3 years, the number has gone from something like 22% to 34% in that survey have responded that a violent response to speech you disagree with is acceptable. And we see that in the culmination of this kind of assassination, and it's a trend we really must reverse.
Jonathan?
May I say what I think about Charlie Kirk, or may I only say what the government says I can say? That's the problem with what's happened in the wake of Charlie Kirk's murder, and it weighs on my mind even to sit on any stage, in any microphone, and speak about a topic that has become so difficult to have conversations about it. The number of people who might hear what I'm saying now and make all kinds of judgments about what I really think without actually asking is the reality of the moment around this topic. So I have to say that first, because I think the reverberations of it have been so just awesome in the sense of their magnitude. Unlike anything, I think, perhaps even more significant than Kimmel or anything else. I think many things that were said here I agree with, especially around violence. No one deserves, obviously, there's no question that free speech does have to be the antidote to violence, as you said so well, Bob. And, on college campuses in particular, it's becoming a very palpable challenge. You talked earlier in the introduction about the practice of liberty, and young people on many college campuses they're being done a disservice. They aren't taught how to do this in high school. They arrive on campuses, and these are real challenges. Now, the details around the actual assassination are still becoming clear, but I think part of the reason that the case reverberated in all the ways that it has is because it, reflected real deep tensions around, that ought to be solved through speech. And, I think that we also have to reckon with the fact that in the wake of what can only be called a tragedy, an assassination, we have political efforts to weaponize it and to use it to punish people. The speed with which a website was created to document and dox people for what they said about this, I mean, is so antithetical to free speech. It's astounding. The speed with which so many institutions of all kinds started moving to fire all kinds of employees, university professors, teachers, air flight attendants. I mean, and each one of those cases itself is complicated. It's raising real questions about, in particular, social media and what it is as a venue. But at a fundamental level, I think that reverberation is saying a lot more, or I should say, both the terrible act and its reverberation each seem to say a lot about this very difficult moment that we're in, where it's becoming clearer and clearer that people are afraid to speak publicly, and with good reason. And that's terrifying.
Which makes it even more important that all three of you have joined us here to actually take the stage and have this conversation. What I hear as an undercurrent, and it is hard. I mean, Jim, I've heard this from a number of my colleagues who do this every day, who get up on stages and who talk, that this has shaken them. There is a new concern about their physical safety that they haven't had to think about when taking the stage. And Jonathan, you're describing a different kind of fear that is coming from standing on the stage and using your words to explain something. There is a culture of fear that I think all of you are just referencing in different ways that is running counter to the culture of free speech. And so I want to just highlight that. And Bob, you wanted to add something.
Well, just to follow up on what Jonathan was talking about, the reaction, the aftermath of the assassination, it's something we've been tracking very closely at FIRE, because there have been violations both of the law of free expression and of the culture of free expression, in seeing people being fired because of social media posts that were considered to be either celebrating the assassination or not sufficiently respectful of Kirk or whatever. In some cases, you had government officials saying that students would be expelled, or in the case of the State Department, they were going to look to see whether foreign students had said anything untoward. And then you have, in the private sector, you have a lot of businesses that are saying they will monitor the social media output of their employees, and if they weren't expressing the right attitude about this, then they would be fired. As terrible as the assassination was, this is what we have said is the cancel culture part of the grief cycle, where we see these feelings being expressed either officially by government actors or in the private sector, and essentially punishing people for their speech. And whether you want to express that as a violation of the First Amendment or a violation of a culture of free expression, both are a matter of concern.
All right, let's take one of the reverberations that everybody knows, which is what happened with Jimmy Kimmel. And so Jimmy Kimmel gets on the stage on his show, and he says something. All right. He then ends up being suspended from his show and is now back on the air. In the interim, there are statements that are made by the FCC. There are other statements that are made by government. There are statements made by the broadcasting side of things. Okay, he's back on the air. Everyone is taught, now I've watched Jimmy since then, and there's references to him being Mr. Free Speech. So what are your thoughts on the situation? What happened to Jimmy Kimmel? If you want to talk about the FCC's comments and their effect both on the culture and on the legal side of free speech. And I'll start with you, Jim.
All right.
Not because your name is Jim.
I was going to say maybe. So I have two thoughts on it, and this is probably a little bit legal. I think I'm thinking about this one as a lawyer a little more so than in some of my last answers. But the first thought is we have to look at who's censoring and who's speaking. And here, the decision to cancel the show for a period of time, which is now ended, was made by, as best we can tell, a private company. And private companies have their own free speech rights. So it's not, to me, if someone's complaining that the private company is censoring Jimmy Kimmel, I'm not sure that that's the right language to use, because that is the private company's right to make its choices about what kind of speech it wants on its channels. The Supreme Court has talked about that in cases like, there's a case called Turner Broadcasting from the 1990s. So that's the first thought I had. But then another thought is, we don't know if the government was pressuring any private entities. And to the extent that they were, the Supreme Court has recognized in many cases over the last 50 years that if the government is pressuring a private company to censor someone, then that becomes a constitutional problem. When the government is sort of pulling the strings behind the scenes and coercing a private entity to do its bidding for it, that becomes an issue. And I don't personally, I've been, as Debbie said, getting ready for a Supreme Court argument, so I have not done a lot of reading on this. I haven't heard anything concrete on that, but that is a consideration. And so that's how I think about this, is like, who's a private actor, where's the government coming in, and how does that play in the whole mix?
Thank you. So that was more of a legal analysis. So Jonathan, give us anything additional on that, going to maybe the culture side.
Well, I'm not a lawyer. I'll start there. So I don't always think about these things through that lens first. And I also don't only, in my work at PEN America, think about free speech issues through the lens of the First Amendment. The First Amendment can move and make a set of decisions that may not be, in support of freedom of expression as a sort of cultural, universal, liberal human right. And so, for me, and it's interesting, just in the same way that I think we would probably all have a different definition of free speech or regulation. For me, I absolutely think that private actors can engage in censorship. I think that if a private university, if Harvard is going to have a talk tomorrow from me, and someone in the government says, well, we're really going to have to regulate Harvard if they let him go out there, and Harvard then tells me we're canceling your talk tomorrow, well, the word I have for that is censorship. I mean, it may not be in a legal sense. Harvard may have that right. That's true as a private actor. So I don't really disagree with the legal analysis there, but I think for when we think about a culture of freedom of expression and we think about these as values, this is one of the certainly like most blatant forms of effort of government pressure. The FCC and Brendan Carr didn't do this through back channels. He did it on a podcast. And for me, watching Jimmy Kimmel and other cases lately, like Texas A&M and some others, what actually is most unsettling for me is the speed and ease with which all manner of speech is being chilled by the current administration and state governments and governors and others, where you have situations where, in that one, Brendan Carr says that on a podcast, and like by that night, Jimmy Kimmel's off the air. And in Texas, you have, Governor Abbott, and you referenced this one, has a tweet with a video of a student yelling at another student. And like anything with a video, you would think would have learned by now, A, might be fabricated, B, what happened just before and just after, you don't really know. But suddenly the governor is tweeting that a student should be expelled from college immediately because of something in a clip. Like, there's no call for due process or investigation. Just expel him, says the governor. And guess what? He was. Fire that professor, said a representative in Texas. And within 2 days, she was. And within a week, he continued to say, and let's fire, I don't like the university president. And then he was. So the friction and ease with which, this is happening is, for me, what's so alarming. And I'll say quickly, we see it in book bans too. A state legislator tweets to a superintendent, I don't like that book, and you must get rid of it on your shelves. And the superintendent says, well, we have a process. And he says, oh, really? And the superintendent says, and that process is we've removed it all right now. And that happens like in a span of 3 or 4 hours on Twitter, okay? What the hell is going on? So I mean, if we don't call all of that censorship or state alarm or violations of First Amendment or against the culture of freedom of speech, well, I don't really know what we're going to start to call it anymore.
All right, Bob.
Yeah, that last point is a very good one, because the speed with which these decisions are being made is a matter of real concern, and the informality of it as well. I can speak a little bit more about how this works at the FCC, because I worked there for 4 years back in the day. I was legal advisor to an FCC commissioner, and then when my boss was elevated to chairman, I was his chief counsel. So I've seen this kind of thing before. There's actually an expression for it in FCC law. It's called regulation by raised eyebrow. Yes, and that is because the FCC issues broadcast licenses, or more to the point, can remove broadcast licenses, although never under these circumstances, then if you displease the agency and you're a licensee, they can have a lot of sway over you. It's been done in the past by having policy speeches given by FCC chairmen or commissioners. It's been done by issuing letters or starting an investigation. But it's important to remember that the FCC is an agency of very limited powers, both by the statute it operates under and under the Constitution. It does not have the authority to take a talk show host off the air or cancel a broadcast station license because they are giving unfavorable coverage to the president. Someone needs to inform Donald Trump of this fact, but nonetheless, there seems to be a lot of confusion over this. In this particular case, and by the way, it didn't start with Kimmel. There have been a number of instances in which the chairman of the FCC, Brendan Carr, has been either restarting investigations or slow rolling approvals for regulatory matters, for approvals of mergers, or in this case, going on a podcast and criticizing Kimmel because of a line that he made about the Kirk assassination. And he went on a podcast and basically said, this is completely unacceptable. We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. And that would mean there will be a lot of more work for the FCC to do. Something needs to be done about Kimmel. So there was nothing subtle about this. This wasn't regulation by raised eyebrow. This was regulation by raised fist. This was out of the, basically, the playbook of The Sopranos. And so instantly, Disney made the decision. Now, Jim, you're right. If a private business makes a decision to take a show off the air, that is their First Amendment right. But if they're a regulated entity that stands to have to face retribution from the federal government, and they make that decision under that pressure, then that is a First Amendment problem, and a problem that the Supreme Court in 2024 unanimously reaffirmed is a violation of the First Amendment. So the Kimmel situation, to hear people talk about it now, they'll say, well, Disney or the affiliates made their own decisions. Well, no, they didn't. And in these circumstances, then you have a real First Amendment problem.
Okay, so we only got through 2 examples. And I'm looking at the time, and I'm guessing you all have questions. All right, so we didn't talk about Comey. We are sitting in a museum. Do you guys remember that there was a executive order around the content at the Smithsonian museums? We didn't talk about that. It's banned Books Week. We didn't talk about that. So I'm planting questions here. I think our panelists would be happy to talk about any of those and more. So who's going to take the mic and ask the first question? Practice the culture of free speech. All right, we have a question over here. I'd ask you to stand just because it's a little hard for us to see you from here. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you for the discussion. It was really interesting. In relation to the Charlie Kirk conversation, I wanted to see what y'all would say about, and not only him, but like conversations about people who have public platforms that may give harmful rhetoric. So like there could be Charlie Kirk, but there could be like also podcasters, like Red Pill podcasters, even like bigger, maybe even news channels and things like that. I wanted to see what the line would be between like free speech and free liberties and or freedom of expression, and like how those freedom of expressions or ideals can contribute to like harm to like a wider community.
So what happens when the speech harms someone or hurts someone? Is that still free speech?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Bob, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, as Jim mentioned earlier, the First Amendment is not absolute. What it is, it creates a presumption in favor of free speech. That is, under the law, speech is protected unless it falls into a category of speech that historically is found not to get that kind of protection. And those categories are limited in number, and they are carefully defined. So things like incitement to crime, speech that is integral to criminal activity, obscenity, defamation, but they are limited in that way. The possibility that someone's speech may lead to a harmful outcome doesn't rise to that level until it reaches the level of incitement. And so it's a very strict test for what rises to that level. And people will ask about, as our Attorney General did, saying and talking about Charlie Kirk, there is free speech and there's hate speech, and we will absolutely go after anyone that engages in hate speech. Well, I'm afraid that this is a teachable moment for our Attorney General. That's not the way the law works. Hate speech is not one of those legal categories. It is lawful but awful, and it is speech that is protected by the First Amendment. Now, again, if it does cross the line into a specific incitement of an illegal act, then it's not protected.
Jim, I want to ask you the same question, and we've properly talked about both the legal and the cultural. We heard a little bit the legal just now. Feel free to add anything on the legal that you want, but what about also on the cultural side? Words can hurt, sticks and stones and all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I agree with what Bob said about the law on these issues, and I also think that one of the things that really worries me is when we want to say that this speech is harmful or this speech is false or this speech is wrong. If the choice is allow us to make those decisions as a society, as speakers and listeners, and if we think it's wrong and we think it's hateful, we shut it down, we don't listen to it, or we speak out against it, we counter-speak, right? Or we give the government the power to determine what's hateful, what's wrong, and that, to me, is more dangerous. And that, to me, is where what Donald Trump thinks is hateful is going to be very different than what President Biden thought was hateful. And so if you give the power to the government to make those decisions, it makes me think of a Supreme Court decision called Alvarez. So Alvarez was decided it was about 12 years ago. It was a case involving the Stolen Valor Act, I believe it was called. And it basically made it a federal crime for you to lie about receiving a military honor. But that was it. You could whisper it. That one of the famous lines in the decision is, you could whisper it in the quiet of a home, but if you're lying to someone, you could be telling your niece or your cousin, yeah, I got this Congressional Medal of Honor, and you would be committing a federal crime. And the court said, no, that goes too far. And some of the concurring and dissenting opinions, which I really enjoyed reading recently, they pointed out the fact that when we're talking about declaring what's true and what's false about things like history, social science, it's dangerous to give the government that kind of power. So that's a thought I have.
Jonathan?
Just to add something more, I think that free speech is one of the most powerful weapons, particularly as forms of satire against people in power and to make social change. And I think that the argument about harm being used to justify censoring speech can be wielded with such incredible breadth that it would be foolish okay, by anyone who believes in democracy to support those kinds of laws and those kinds of ideas. So often we have actually also seen, as someone who I said earlier, I really do believe a lot in public education and knowledge. And we have seen such laws also be used to justify, for example, purging from YouTube educational videos about the Holocaust that were factual, collected in concentration camps at the end of the war, videos that might harm a viewer, etc. And so those kinds of analyses can go in a lot of different ways. But at the same time, I also think we have to be also really thoughtful about that lawful but awful or counter speech or however we think about it. It behooves us all to recognize that there is still a lot of hate and still a lot of sort of work to do to be a more pluralistic society, and that to the point that I think's been made a few times here, things cut both ways. We didn't, the consequence culture, cancel culture flip of left and right of the past month or whatever is fascinating to me because it's just so incredibly ridiculous and hypocritical, or we can talk about the Smithsonian executive order or whatever, but how about Trump's first executive order, which was all about, anyone remember?
Free speech.
Free speech. This would be the administration the most committed to free speech, followed by all the executive orders that have come since, which are clearly at odds with it. So these are weird times. I don't know how to make sense of that. And even 2 days ago, what did he say about flag burning? That now he thought it was illegal, and so it would be, and so
No, at the same time, the question that you asked is yes. Thank you so much for asking that question, because I think that's a question on a lot of people's mind, because words can hurt. So I'm going to encourage people to, the museum is in a year of free speech, and we have an exhibit on, Elaine, which floor is our right and our responsibility? Okay, so downstairs on the ground floor is an exhibit about free speech, our right, our responsibility, because we've been talking primarily about the right. There are responsibilities that run along with having these rights, and so your question is tapping into the responsibility side. We very much appreciate it. Elaine, it is 7:29. Do I have time for one more question? All right, who has the last question? Yes, right over here.
Hi. Kind of bouncing off her question a bit. From someone who grew up in a deeply, deeply conservative household, that felt a lot of what they said was extremely hateful. And something that I believed until I was about in high school, and then I started to realize that a lot of what my family had said and done was quite awful. How do you guys have any advice on how to unlearn things? And because it's something I've been working on for about 15 years, and I feel as though I've been doing an okay, a good job. But I know you guys are about free speech, but I do believe that there is a difference between really awful, hateful speech and free speech. So just your thoughts on learning.
How do you expand your thinking on something once you start to question whether what you've been taught is right? Which is probably something that almost every young person goes through.
I think the best object lesson that speaks to your question was presented on a podcast called The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling. And it was hosted by Megan Phelps Roper, who, if you recognize the name, was the granddaughter of Fred Phelps, who founded the Westboro Baptist Church, a hateful little cult out in Kansas that preached that all of the world's ailments were the result of God's anger, that we were too permissive of homosexuality. She grew up in that culture, and these are the people who would go to military funerals and hold signs saying, God hates fags, thank God for dead soldiers, really hateful stuff. Became the subject of a Supreme Court decision that we could spend the entire evening talking about. But anyway, she grew up in that environment, and in this podcast, she talks about her journey growing up in that environment to basically learning to be tolerant. And it was through the exchange of ideas. It was through answering people who were criticizing the church that she grew up in and having to engage in that dialogue. She ultimately left the church because she saw a better way of living. But her discussion of her personal journey and the fact that free speech and the exchange of ideas were central to that journey, I think was the most powerful demonstration I've seen.
So thank you for asking that question. And what we didn't get to talk about is just how much self-censorship is happening. It's not just the government censoring. A lot of people are being careful about what they think and say, but you just stood up and asked a question and started a journey. We wish you good luck on that journey. And I hope you listen to that podcast. Okay. All right. So that is our time, unfortunately. There are lots. Glad you enjoyed it. Glad you enjoyed it. I think one of the things I'm going to ask you all to think about is we started with a discussion of why these three men decided to make free speech a focus of their career and spend their time and effort fighting for. And we heard one description as, in a way, these are all free speech rebels. I invite all of you to think about whether you are free speech rebels and what that looks like for you. Yes, there's a free speech shirt right here, so yes, we're underway. But yes, are we free speech rebels? What's needed right now? Does your voice count? Does your pen count? All right. Elaine?
I really got to get stairs on the side of the stage. I realize I've done this so many times. I just need to ask. But so I just want to thank everybody again for coming out tonight. It means a lot. I know we have lots going on as a city. Go Eagles, go Phillies, yay! But what I wanted to mention is, as I say, this is the culmination of our year of free speech. Coming in March, we are switching over to our year of freedom of assembly. This is a freedom we don't discuss very often. We don't understand it as well. There's been one book, we've done a lot of research on this, it's framed in the forgotten freedom. So we're gonna focus on many different aspects. We also happen to be celebrating our semi-quincentennial, 250 years of this fantastic country. There's going to be a lot going on. I encourage you to come back. We've got a lot going on with the museum. If you had a good time, my sales pitch is become a member. The front desk can help you on your way out. If you liked the ringing of the bell, purchase a bell. Why not? It's fun. The Liberty Bell is awesome. We're also going to have little mini projects. Just keep up to date with what we're doing. We're going to take our fantastic bell on the road, which you can ring tonight if you want. We also don't want to stop the conversation here. We're going to continue our reception down in our Flame Gallery. Please continue the conversation. This is what this museum's about. If you've got questions, feel free to reach out to any of the staff. We're so glad you're here. Please come back. Thank you so much.